when Adam sinned, as we said, God instructed him to sacrifice a lamb, a symbol of the coming Savior. And this type, from the gates of Eden, would last all the way till the Savior did come. And of course, this was passed on from father to son, and the patriarchs there, they knew that from the gates of Eden they received this promise of a Savior in this sacrifice. And so Abraham sacrificed, Isaac sacrificed, and Jacob sacrificed. But they did not know anything about feast days. You see, it was later on that God added to the sacrifices the feasts, which indicated certain times and events of things that will happen in the plan of salvation. Now, the reason why I'm emphasizing that is because a lot of the times people say, well, you know, the feasts, they had sacrifices on them. Well, the Sabbath had sacrifices too, and so we still keep the Sabbath without the sacrifices, so we can therefore keep the feast without the sacrifices and try and disengage or separate the feasts from the sacrifices. I'll tell you now, you cannot do that. You cannot do this. We'll see why in the scriptures why you cannot do that. The Sabbath was never married to the sacrifices, as we shall see. Let me illustrate that. I like illustrations, if you haven't figured that out yet. The Sabbath was given in Eden, right? And then at the fall, sacrifices were instituted. And no doubt, when people would come to worship on the Sabbath, part of their worship would have involved offering sacrifices, an expression of their faith in the coming Savior. But the Sabbath existed before sacrifices and independent of sacrifices. Later on, God instituted the sacrificial system. And then at the Exodus and at Sinai, God added other elements to the sacrificial system that was already in place. He added feasts, He added a sanctuary, and He added a priesthood, among other things. And these three elements, brothers and sisters, were all tied and married to the sacrifices. The priesthood, its purpose and function was to offer sacrifices. You can't have a priest with nothing to offer, right? The sanctuary was the place where you offered these sacrifices. And the feasts were the special times and seasons and occasions to offer these sacrifices. They were married and tied to this system, and they were actually subservient to it, to the sacrificial system. The entire Jewish economy revolved around the sacrificial system, or around the symbol for Christ. That's what it was all about. And so this particular point, as far as the feast being for sacrifice, I want to read this verse from the same chapter, Leviticus 23. These are the feasts of the Lord which ye shall proclaim to be holy convocations, to offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord, a burnt offering and a meat offering, a sacrifice and a drink offering, everything upon his day. Notice what the purpose of the feast here is according to this verse. It is to do what? To offer an offering. So I'll ask you a question. Of the two, which is more important and significant? The feast or the sacrifices? The sacrifices. Let me ask it this way. Can you keep the feast without offering a sacrifice when God gave this instruction? No. Could you keep the sacrifices without having a feast? There was a time when these sacrifices existed and you can't sacrifice without having a feast. So of the two, one is more important than the other, and one is attached to the other in this relationship. And there's a reason why I'm saying that, and there's a reason why God set it up this way, as we shall see. And the reason and the purpose for this entire system that God gave, Hebrews 9 and verse 10 tells us about the first covenant and the tabernacle, which stood only in meats and in drinks and in diverse washings and carnal ordinances, imposed on them until the time of Reformation. What's the time of Reformation? The coming of Christ. It was a temporary system. God instituted a temporary system on Mount Sinai to last until the seed should come. And this is what the time of Reformation is talking about. Wherefore then serveth the law, it was added because of transgressions, till the seed should come. That's the first coming of Christ. To whom the promise was made, and it was ordained by angels in the hand of a mediator. That's the time of Reformation. And at such a time, this system would come to an end. And the verse that indicates that to us is Daniel chapter 9 and verse 27. And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease. Now many times I have heard this verse quoted and used to prove that the sacrifices and the oblations ceased. And that's the only thing that ceased and nothing else. But brothers and sisters, when God talks about the sacrifices and oblations, He is talking about the primary symbol that represents Christ and everything that was attached to it along the way. God does not have to spell out every single thing that was attached to the sacrificial system. When that went, everything attached with it went. I'll put it here in our illustration. When He causes the sacrifice and oblation to cease, if the sacrifice goes, do you still keep the seventh-day Sabbath? Because it pre-existed the sacrificial system, right? It stands on its own. It was never attached to the sacrificial system. It was never dependent on the sacrificial system. But when the sacrifices go, does the priesthood go? Well, what's the priest going to offer? He has nothing else to offer. So this Aaronic priesthood, the priesthood that God instituted at Mount Sinai, goes with the sacrifice. So in Daniel, God does not have to say also the priesthood is also ceased. That's included in the sacrifices ceasing, so that goes. What about the sanctuary? Same reasoning. Of course it goes. God doesn't have to say, oh, by the way, and the sanctuary also will cease. When the sacrifices ceased, everything subservient to it and attached to it automatically goes. So what about the feasts? Or will they stay? That's the argument. That is not consistent. That does not make sense, brothers and sisters. The feasts were dependent on the sacrifices. The feasts are actually included in that verse. When God brought to an end the system of sacrifices and oblations, with it goes the days that were given to offer certain sacrifices on. And so this is why the time of the Reformation is the time when these things came to an end. These were all ceremonial types that pointed forward to the coming of the Savior.